Welcome along to Obsession Engineering, and today I am colour coded in orange because I'm going to be working on my 2008 ZX10. Because if I'm honest, for the last couple of years it's not had a lot of attention and it had a little wee on the floor, and I decided it was really time to give it a little bit of love. So a bit of background on the ZX10. This is a really early 2008 ZX10. It was in fact the first customer bike in Lincolnshire. I've owned it from brand new. That makes it about 17 years old at the time of filming, and if I'm honest, I love this bike to bits. This is the third ZX10 I owned. My first ever big bike was a 2004 ZX10, which I did super stock on. Then I had the Wheelbarrow 06 bike, which is the first bike I did TT on. We called the 2006 bike the Wheelbarrow for two reasons. Firstly, it had two exhaust pipes stuck out the back that looked like wheelbarrow handles, and secondly, it steered about as well as a wheelbarrow as well. But then, when the 08 bike came out, they got the chassis right. So this went a lot closer back to the 04 bike. But it had a longer swinging arm for more stability, it was generally a little bit nicer to ride, and it had more power than the other bikes as well. This is a proper superstock bike from 2008, so it's kit ECU, full Acra system, Öhlins fork internals in the front, an Öhlins shock in the back, and superstock rules back then, you could do a little bit to the engine, so it's got a thin head gasket in it, it's got a bit of cam timing. When the engine's fresh, it's about 180 horsepower. Admittedly, fresh was a few years ago, so it's dropped off a little bit, but last time I had it running on the dyno it was 175, so it's still a quick motorbike. So I did 5 years at TT on this bike, and in fact the second time I went to TT was on this bike, and we did 120 mile an hour lap in the senior, so I have a very soft spot for this thing. I went on to race it there for 5 years, and then when I stopped racing it there and bought my RS34, Eric borrowed it and did a couple of seasons on it. It has, of course, also been to the Northwest 200, the Ulster Grand Prix. Back when we could race big bikes at Scarborough, it raced there. I went everywhere and did everything I could on this bike, and I love it to bits. But with the advent of newer, faster things, it got shuffled down the order. And for the last couple of years, it's basically been dragged out for the occasional track day or the occasional wet club race. And now it gets to the point where it needs a little bit of loving up. So I'm not going crazy full restoration on it. That is not what it's for. This is still a workhorse. But I want to be able to use it to go to the occasional track day or maybe even do a bit of riding instruction with Rapid on it. This is still going to get used because it is still a really good bike. As well as this being an opportunity to give my bike a little bit of TLC, it's also a chance for me to reminisce about some of the awesome things I've done on motorbikes, and especially with this bike. So we'll get the bench pumped up, and then we'll get the fairing off it, and we'll have a little bit of a look underneath. Miraculously, most of the fairing fasteners are actually original ZX10 fasteners from the road bike kit. So all the ones that hold the side panels on are the originals from when I stripped the road bike. How I've not managed to lose those over the years is an absolute mystery. But the belly pans had a little bit of action, shall we say, and quite a lot of repairs, because bottom of Bray Hill, bottom of Bagara at TT, they tend to wear things out. And this bike has been through the bottom of both of those a good few times. And inside the belly pan we can see a bit of damp as well from where the radiator leaked, which frankly is the main reason this bike is on the bench today, because leaky motorbikes are not what we want. And okay, I don't actually work on this one that often because it's not critical in the fleet sort of thing, but it is nice and easy to work on. There's not many fasteners hold the fairing on, and everything generally comes apart pretty easily. So 6 Zeus fasteners, 6 actual bolts, and the whole kit is off. There is character everywhere on this thing. That stone chip there was Ulster Grand Prix. I can't remember what year. Forrest Dunn borrowed the bike because he didn't have a bike at the time, and I had this kicking about, sort of basically spare because I had my BMW. And I think Forrest lapped, I think, at 126 mile an hour on it at the Ulster. Slightly annoyingly faster than me, but because he's racing there and it's a proper road race, you get lots of stone chips. So that has had a chunk out of it for years. So obviously this bike was originally built in 2008, and we did stuff a little bit differently back then. if I'm honest, yes. We've learned to do stuff nicer since then. But this is in the days of chicken wire as your radiator guard. Bit of foam behind it so it stands off, so when the stone's hit it, it doesn't just smash into the radiator. And that, over the years, has obviously saved quite a lot of damage. But this radiator had previously already had a repair in it, and the repair is beginning to leak. So it is time to take that radiator off and put a new one on it. Because this is the end of winter, the bike still has antifreeze in it. And if I'm honest, it's had antifreeze in it for a while, because ever since I last raced it, it's just been sat and doing the occasional track day. So antifreeze stops stuff corroding inside and gives your bike a fighting chance of not freezing up and cracking an engine over winter. So we'll get the last of the antifreeze out. And that was interesting that even though the radiator is leaking, it's actually still held a little bit of pressure when it's cooled down. So we'll get all the blue out of that, and then we'll take the radiator off. So now I've got the water out of it, taking the rest of the radiator off should be, I say, pretty simple. So there's a pipe either side. I think there's actually a couple on the other side, a little one at the top that feeds out the cylinder head, and these ones up here. But they are going to be pretty snug because they've been on there a good while now, because this thing hasn't been having the engine out of it every winter like it would have been when it was getting raced. So a pair of pipe grips just like cracks the seal on the pipe a little bit, and sometimes we have to crack the seal. So now that I've loosened all the pipes on the other side and made sure this one moves nice and easily, I've loosened the bolt, or in fact taken the bolt out that holds the bottom of the radiator, and so now there is only one left, because these ZX10 radiators, they like hook onto a lug on the other side, so there is literally just one bolt at the bottom, one bolt at the top. And there we go, slide off the lug on the other side, splash a bit of coolant around, because it doesn't matter how well you think you've drained a coolant system, there is always coolant left in it, so try and drain as much of that off as possible. Might have a little clean up underneath before I fit the new one. Old radiator, admittedly the back of it, because that's how I've got it on the bench, versus new radiator, and this is China's finest. And if I'm honest, there's nothing wrong with these Chinese sort of replica radiators. The build quality looks quite decent on it. I've fitted them to a few bikes and they work pretty well. The actual sort of size of the matrix, the core, isn't quite as fine as this one. Like the rows are closer together on these than they are on the Chinese one, so the Chinese one probably won't cool as well, but being as the original one doesn't hold water, it's going to be considerably better than that. And this was about 100 quid. A new one of those is about 600 quid. So I know where I'm going to be spending my money. Alright, replacement radiator fitted, all the pipes are done up, the lovely piece of chicken wire is back on. Obviously there's bits of foam to stop it actually chafing on the front of the radiator itself, so that is done. Oh, probably ought to actually do that bolt up. It's a good job I do this stuff to camera, otherwise I'd have forgotten that. Right, with that done, I could put some antifreeze in it. But it's actually home time because I started this quite late on, and so I'll be back in the morning to put some antifreeze in it. Right, so having had a lovely refreshing evening off, back in the workshop, and I've roped Robin for a minute because it's a little bit easier to bleed the water up in the radiator with two people, because the radiator is designed with the sort of outlet inlet at the top, which if we had it on a side stand would mean the air could come out, but we don't have a side stand, so if Rob leans it over a bit towards him, then it goes gurgle, gurgle, and then that means I can just top my antifreeze up. But yeah, that's got all the air out of that, so get her up right, Rob. We can pop the paddock stand back in, and that is coolant system done. Having got the water system to hold water, I'm now going to treat it to an oil change. And now I've got the mic to actually connect properly to my camera, you can hear me a bit better. So, cut my lock wire off, 17mm spanner on the sump plug, give it a bit of a nudge to undo it, and I can't actually remember how much mileage this oil's done, well, and we don't have an odometer working on this bike, but I know it's been in there at least a couple of years, so it definitely wants changing. So we're going to let that drain out for a minute, and in fact, while that's draining, we can get up there and loosen the oil filter, which means I need to undo the Jubilee clip around it that holds it in place. And then my preferred tool for undoing oil filters is the big grips. You can get like the cups you put around the end of the filter, but this tends to undo tighter stuff without slipping too much. With the rather ratty old oil filter coming undone, it will dribble oil all over my header pipes, but We'll give that a clean off later with some brake cleaner. While my oil's draining out, I can look at my new selection of bolts. We've not gone titanium. It doesn't need that level of expense, basically, putting into it. But some of the fasteners are looking a little bit scruffy. And so it is time to throw a little bit of love towards it. As dodgy as that sounds. Right, we will put some front axle pinch bolts in there. They're going to replace the ones that are going a little bit rusty and horrible. And then we've also got some for the top and bottom yokes, calipers, pad pins, but we're going to have the brakes off in a minute anyway, and sprocket nuts to do later. So now that most of my oil is drained out, it's time to prepare a filter. So I have my filter, and I've got some Motul 300V 1040, because we're only putting the good stuff in track bikes. Get that onto there, and it just gives it a little bit of a chance to get a bit of oil into the filter first and basically prime the filter up. Give that a couple of minutes, screw that back onto the engine, pop the sump plug back in, put some oil in it. Easies. Just remembered something great about this ZX10. The oil filler cap opening is big enough that you can actually get the bottle in. We can just pour that in and tip it upside down. Saves having a funnel. So I've got enough 300V Motul in that we've got at the sort of the top line on the sight glass, and that's lovely and clean, so that's good. When we run it, it will go down a little bit, so we're not lock wiring anything yet. But there's one more thing to do before I run it, and that's to change this massive exhaust silencer that's on the bike, which isn't actually technically correct for this bike, but gets it through really strict noise limits, and put the slightly noisier one back on. Because the first couple of tracks of the season are Cadwell, and it's relatively relaxed on noise limits, so we may as well have the noisy one back on. Liberate that last couple of horsepower. With my normal short-circuit race spec silencer back on, it's time to fire the big girl up. Ignition key is down here, next to the dashboard, because where it sits there, it actually sticks out quite a lot. And at TT, I used to headbutt it and bend it. And so I moved it out of the way before I snapped the key off in it. It is on kit ignition, so it doesn't actually need it. But it saved me putting a different switch in. So, this has been on the same lithium battery for over 10 years. Sometimes it's a bit lazy when it's cold. Not bad. Just wait for the oil light to go out. Right, oil light's out. We'll run it up for a little bit, get oil everywhere. And then turn it off, reset the air gap, oil level. I know what I'm talking about really. Having run it for a bit, I've reset the oil level, lock wired the sump plug, and now I'm moving on to front brakes. So what I did many years ago is I actually drilled through the caliper body and through the pad pin so that I could lock wire the pad pins together. But since then I've found a nicer solution. So what I'm going to do is take them off, take the calipers off, give them a good clean, have actually got some new pads to go in them as well, and replace the pad pins with something a little nicer. Need to cut off the lock wire that holds the old pad pins in, and one of the reasons for changing the pad pins is they've been in and out that often that where they bottom in the hole has obviously moved slightly over the years, and now, to get the lock wire holes to line up, you don't have the pins tight. And I'd like to actually have them tight even though they are lock wired. So, that one was a bit tight, but that one... Actually, this caliper's not too bad. The other caliper I've already done, and they were quite loose. So the next thing I need to do is undo my calipers, wiggle the caliper off, and then I can take the pad pins all the way out, pads out. So, these ones have done a fair chunk of mileage. Don't actually know how much, but they are getting a little bit low, and it's always worth having a new set for the price of them. One of the ones in the other caliper was particularly low, so they are destined for the bin. But before we put the new ones in though, we're going to give the calipers a clean. So now we've got the pads out. Even for me, this bench is quite high now. I'm just going to pump the brake a little bit, just so the pistons just start moving a little bit away from the seals, so that any dirt that is basically just inside the caliper body before the dust seal is exposed to me. And then Motul Moto Wash, 50-50 with water, give it a shake, and you basically got yourself a really nice brake cleaning fluid. We used to use brake cleaner for cleaning brakes because that's what it said on the tin. But then we found out that it's quite good at drying out seals. And so now what we use is basically soapy water. So using a bike specific cleaner lifts the dirt off the pistons and the calipers really nicely. It's not aggressive to the seals. Get as far around the pistons as you can with your toothbrush. Not planning to use it on my teeth again later, but it's up to you if you do. So obviously getting to the bit you can see nice and easily is nice and easy. But the bit sort of the piston that's buried right close to the actual caliper body can be quite awkward to get to. And so I've got a set of these, and these are piston pliers. So they slide in the piston and then you can like twist the piston round. So pop that in there, and bit by bit I can move the piston around to expose the dirty bit that would have been sat right against the caliper body, and then you can be absolutely sure that you're getting your calipers really clean. Now I'll just basically rinse them off with a bit of clean water. That's all my old brake dust gone. Any bugs and bits that are stuck in there gone. One clean caliper, give it a blast with the airline to dry it off, and then we can push the pistons back nice and gently by hand, one by one. If you give them a really good shove, sometimes they move the fluid that fast that they'll just pop another seal out, another piston out, and you don't want that. And so just nice and slowly squeeze the pistons so they push the fluid back up into the master cylinder, and then we'll make sure everything's nice and dry, pop some new pads in. If your pistons don't move easily, there's a good chance you've got some corrosion underneath the seal tracks, and the seal might be holding the piston really tight. So always good to give a little poke on your piston. So to replace my old original pad pins, I've bought some nice Pro Bolt ones. So the heads on these, the hex head, actually stick out of the caliper a bit easier, and they're pre-drilled for lock wiring. So I've smeared a little bit of copper slip on them so that as they're going in and out the calipers quite regularly, they're not going to drag on the caliper and damage the thread. And I'm going to put some EPFA EBC pads in it. I like quite a heavily sintered pad. I like that initial bite you get from a sintered. I've used these in quite a lot of bikes. They're not the full race GPFAX, but the EPFAs have good range of temperatures and bits they'll work over, so they're probably a little bit better than a OEM pad normally, and I like the feel from them, so pop them in. So with that all clean, pads in, slide that back in, and the ZX10's actually got like dowel positions for the caliper. Most calipers, they can move a little bit on the bolts, but these can't. These are fixed in place, so that can sit there for a second, and then get my shiny new caliper bolts out. The other ones have done excellent service, but I think we can treat it to some new caliper bolts. Again, copper slip because they're going to come in and out fairly regularly. The camera is sitting on the toolbox, and Rob needs to get something out of my toolbox, so he's being very, very careful not to disturb anything, aren't you, Rob? Yes, Rob. So just pretend he's not here. I try it regularly. I've not managed it yet. Right. Caliper bolts torqued up. I'm not going to use my torque wrench again for a while so we can take the torque off it so the spring tension doesn't go wrong. And the last thing I'm going to do is lock wire my two pad pins together. I don't have to, it's not in any regulations or anything, but it's relatively easy, and I have seen the pad pins fall out before, and that's generally not a good thing because they're generally very quickly followed by your brake pads. A little bend on the end of my lock wire to begin with, so it'll sort of hook in the pad pin in the hole and stick out the middle of the hole a little bit. So get in there with our lock wire and pliers, grab the end of it, pull it through so the ends are about even length, grip it with those, pull it tight enough so we've got a nice consistent twist. Tuck the end of the lock wire back in another hole and grab the end of my pliers, pull that tight, nip it up, and a reasonable pull on that. Again, nice consistent spin on the wire, cut the end off, and then get the end of the wire, twist it back on itself and tuck the end in. And that means you don't stab your finger on your piece of lock wire. And if we have a nice close look at that, you'll see this one is before the 6 o'clock position, so the wire is ever so slightly pulling clockwise on it, and this one is ever so slightly before the 12 o'clock position, so it's pulling ever so slightly clockwise on that bolt. So that lock wire is pulling both bolts tight, so they can't come loose even a fraction. Part of my logic for lock wiring the pad pins, but not actually the main caliper bolts, is if I want to swap onto a set of wet wheels quickly, I don't want to have to cut the lock wire off and then redo it. And also, these ones I've torqued up. These ones, if you over tighten them even a little bit, aren't unknown for cracking the caliper body. So I tend to just do these with a relatively light nip and then lock wire them, so that you don't have to go overly tight with them. Brake line routing is something I've definitely got better at over the years, and this was one of the very early sets of like T-piece brake lines, and there is only one T in it, there's not an elbow there, and one brake line's going around the outside of the fork leg, which I prefer nowadays. I prefer that tucking around there because it can't get trapped between the mudguard and the wheel, it definitely can't get in the tyre, but that one goes down here and goes past the mudguard, and if I try and move this one to the outside, the brake line isn't long enough. And if I'm honest, if I'd have paid attention to this the other day, I'd have probably ordered a fresh brake line. But I didn't, and so what I'm just going to do with this is tie it down a little bit nicer. So I've already swapped the cable tie that was literally holding it flat to the yoke with an electrical P-clip, because that's a slightly nice way of doing it. And on the sides here, I'm going to mount it with a little bit of fuel pipe between the fork leg and the actual brake line, and it just gives everything a little bit of movement and stops everything fretting together. So we start off with a little piece of pipe and a cable tie, fold that through there, pass it through there, and then we're going to wrap that round the brake line first, as if my finger with the brake line. Then we're going to pass it back through there and put the long end round the fork leg, basically like that, so you end up with a little figure of 8 with the rubber thing holding your brake line off. Except that's not a brake line, that's my finger, so let's do it properly. And there we have the brake line tied to the fork leg, and so you can see there, cable tie, bit of fuel pipe, brake line, which is not the nicest thing in the world anymore, just tied just off the fork leg, stops it fretting and anything. Happy days. So the last thing to do on the front brakes, now we've got clean calipers and fresh pads and some new fancy bolts and some lock wire, is to bleed some new fluid into it, because the stuff that's in it is looking a bit dark, which is generally a good sign that it's going off. So we're going to be putting some Motul RBF 700 in it. That's mega high boiling point stuff. We've tried it back to back with what is rumoured to be the best fluids out there, and it is as good, if not better, than the fancy Italian stuff that you get with a lot of fancy Italian brakes. So what we need to do is pump the fluid from there through the brake lines, through the calipers and out into a suitable pot. I'm actually using my vacuum brake bleeder, but I'm not going to use the vacuum thing today because I'm going to show you how to do it the correct way, the old-fashioned way. So the system is pretty simple. The master cylinder pumps the fluid down the brake lines into the calipers, and then when we open the bleed nipple, the pressure we're pulling on the lever will push the fluid out, and then when we release the lever with the bleed nipple closed, it'll have to draw the fluid from the reservoir back into the master cylinder. So it's going reservoir, squeeze, pressure, release the pressure, out, lock it off, let the lever go, pull back from the top. Pretty simple. Basically, it's a lot of pumping and squeezing. And hopefully, it won't take too long till we're finished. So the last few goes of bleeding it up, what we're going to do is the proper way of doing it, which is pull a bit of pressure, crack the bleed nipple open, close the bleed nipple, release the lever. And that way it can't pull anything back along the line to the bleed bottle, and it has to pull new fluid through the system. So we'll just do that 2 or 3 times to make sure the caliper is completely clear of air bubbles. But the very last one, I'll just crack it a little bit, and halfway through the lever stroke I'll close it while we're still pushing pressure into it. So give the bleed nipple a good little nip, and then very carefully take the pipe off because we don't want to leak a load of fluid everywhere. Lever feels good. Last little nip on the bleed nipple. 1 caliper done, 1 to go. So the front brake line might not be brand new, the second one is decidedly second hand. So many years ago I rubbed through the sort of plastic cover that goes over it, and what I have noticed is nowadays my boot rubs it that much I think I'm beginning to damage the braid on it. So it is very definitely time to replace that, and so I have a new one that is exactly the same to go on it, but what I am going to do is rotate it round on the banjo position a little bit more so it's a bit more out of the way of my foot. So I just need to take this one off, hence the piece of blue roll so any brake fluid soaks into that and not all over the rest of the bike. Take it off down at the caliper as well. We have more blue roll for that, and then literally pop the replacement on, nip it with new copper washers, bleed it through. I mean, while I'm here I might clean the caliper as well, but let's not go crazy now. With my new brake line fitted and just tucked in a little bit more so my foot doesn't rub on the braid, on the plastic, that's fitted, bled up and ready to go. So the next thing we need to do is go around to the other side of the swinging arm. So I know from using them for years that the Superbike chains are really strong. They're very, very good quality. But this one, I have absolutely no idea off the top of my head how long it's been on the bike. I mean, if I go back in the book that's got all of the information for the ZX10 in it, I will find when that chain went on. I suspect I put it on when Forrest used it for the Ulster Grand Prix. That's a good few years ago, and it's seen quite a lot of action since then, and quite a lot of wet and dry and stuff, and so I think it's time to treat it to a new one. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to change the sprockets. So I used to run the road race gearing everywhere 1740. At Scarborough, it meant you could get off the hairpins without the bike trying to kill you to death in the face, because it just made it slightly lazy off the hairpin, so you could basically pin the throttle wide open and just stand on the back brake, and off it would go up the hill. It made life quite easy. But if you ride it on track now, compared to modern litre bikes, my BMW, my V420, stuff like that, it's a little bit flat, because it just doesn't have like the gear to pull sort of thing. Because I've basically got it geared too tall. And so I'm going to go 1640. It will give us a tiny bit more wheelbase, but this bike works with the wheel really long, and a new chain and bits on it. Then it will be safe to ride, chain-wise, for another few thousand miles. So chain splitting next, and I have a tool that will push the pins through. But if I'm honest, it's always easier if you ground the heads off them first. So I always grind the heads off my rivets. So now that I've ground the heads off, I could put my chain riveting or braking tool on and push the pins out. But being as this chain's scrap anyway, I'm just going to chisel the side plate off. Because sometimes the old-fashioned ways are the easiest. And with that done, we can literally just pull the old chain off, chuck it in the scrap bin. Now we've got the chain off and the sprockets are all loose, we can take the wheel out. And because this was a TT bike, we have a relatively quick release back wheel. Now I will admit, I only ever did one wheel change at TT with this bike. Well, in fact, I've only ever done one wheel change at pit stop at TT at all, and it was with this bike. Because I still lost a bit of time in the pits, and the year after we moved to Dunlops. And the Dunlops last considerably better than the Metzlers we had before, and so we didn't need to do pit stops anymore, but certainly not at the speed I was riding. But I will admit this spindle's not been out in a while, so it might be a little on the snug side. So, get a bit of a tap, get it mostly moving. And I do normally put my foot underneath it to support it. Yep, that's fighting a little bit today. Get a drift and just do it like that. And then roll the wheel back, spacers are captive, caliper stays where it is. Happy days, we've got a wheel out, we can change the sprockets. So I fitted my new Renthal sprocket, and I fitted it with some new Pro Bolt stainless steel sprocket nuts. Because these aren't locking nuts, I have put a dabble Loctite underneath them and torqued them up. So that is fitted, so we are in effect one tooth at the front smaller than when we start. We're on 1640, and what I've done then is just cut the chain to the right length and just temporarily popped the side plate on so I can tension up and make sure we've actually got enough adjustment in the swinging arm. One night at TT, in fact it was the first year I had this bike there, so it'd be 2008, and the Friday night of practice before race week started, we put a new chain in it, and Kev, who was mechanicking for me at the time, said to me, steady start, steady roll down rail, don't stress the chain too much to launch. And then, of course, I got to the gate to leave, and I was sat next to Ryan Farquhar on his 2008 ZX10 with it sat on launch control, and I thought, I could get a tow here and see where I'm losing time or where I'm gaining or learn something. And so I had probably my most enthusiastic start at that point ever at TT, and Kev had his head in his hands and gave me a telling off. But the chain was bedded in by St Ninians, and so it was worth it. We just did the one lap, came in, and then the bike was basically prepped ready for the next day. Right, and on that note, I need to rivet that up, and so I'll roll it round here so we can get the rivet tool in and talk you through it. So in years gone by, the rivet links were like these ones. They were solid-ended, and you basically put a tool on and hit them with a hammer, which was quite therapeutic. But unfortunately, things have modernised slightly, and so now we have a tool for like splaying the end out instead. And so what we do is we have to put the the end link on first. So we'll slide the tool into place. We're going to use this plate here, which basically pushes the plate on until the rivets hit this back plate, which means you can't go too far. I mean, you do need 7 hands to be able to actually hold the tool in place, but when we get it in the right sort of area there, we screw this in until the side plate is all the way on the chain. You can now see this is the old style rivet that you used to sort of peen over with a hammer, and this is the new one, and the hole in the middle, you push basically like a ball into it and it splays the whole end over. So the next thing to do is set the tool up for splaying. Probably a better term for that, but I can't remember what it is. The end of this tool here has a little sort of circle in it, and that's used for splaying the end over. There is a set location for it, but it tends to find its own way into the middle. And then we'll just screw the tool down. And if we take that off, we'll have a slightly closer look at that, and you can now see that this one's all splayed out. So that means that that one's riveted. We just need to do the same with that one. So with the radiator, the oil and filter, the chain and sprockets, the brakes, all that stuff done, I probably ought to just check the air filter, because it will be a little bit silly to do everything else and then find there's a mouse living in my airbox. And so we'll whip the seat, the tank and the airbox top off. I have already undone all the bolts for the seat unit. It isn't this quick release normally. But shall we just say it's not difficult to take apart. Right, a couple of bolts at the front of the tank. This ZX10 is easy to work on. If I'm honest, Kawasaki's in general, they tend to make things that are fairly straightforward to work on. My record for getting a like an 09 shaped ZX6 engine out in one of my own race bikes, so I'd already done the prep, from complete bike to engine on the bench was 50 minutes on my own, which I was quite pleased with. They're also not too bad to take apart. Cassette gearbox, everything comes apart easy. Yeah, pretty good. These things aren't cassette gearbox, they're not quite as easy, but they're certainly not bad to take apart, as hopefully is being proven in this video. Fuel tank off. Another job that's easy on the ZX10. Once I've undone the top injectors, I'm going to leave that connected. A few bolts around the outside, and airbox lid can just lift off. And then we can check the air filter. It has got an aftermarket washable in it, and that's pretty good. I'll flick a couple of stones out of it, blow it off with the airline, and that can go back in. First year at TT we ran the standard air filter, checked it halfway through practice week, it was filthy. After that we changed it. They're not massive surface area, so they do get dirty quite easily. But the important bit of the airbox looks clean, so we'll give this a quick go over, bob it all back together. So with my air filter cleaned it and oiled and bolted back in, I've put all the bodywork back on, and the ZX10 is basically ready to go back on track where it belongs. Okay, I will admit, it could do with a bit of a polish, but this thing's never going to be mint, and it doesn't want to be. I love the fact that it's got some scratches, it's got some battle scars, it's got character built into it. And working on the bike and remembering some of the sort of great things I've done at TT and the Ulster Grand Prix and the Northwest and Scarborough, there's been some great times that I've been with this bike, and this is the great thing about machines. Like, it is just nuts and bolts, but it's given me enjoyment. It's given me something to really, really love. And so I hope you get some enjoyment out of your bikes as well. I'm going to when the sun is shining and we get this thing back on a racetrack. But for now, thank you for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.